This man is a minister's son, a former professor, an ivory tower intellectual thrown into the arena of world politics. He is the President of the United States. Within his lifetime, he will be acclaimed and idolized. But from his deathbed, he will see his dreams, his plans for world peace, crumble into dust. His name is Woodrow Wilson, and this is his biography.
Every world leader has their controversies and are judged by history as to their successes and failures. President Woodrow Wilson is no exception. Progressives today often look at Wilson as the first truly modern reformer and benchmark Democrat. More objective observers look to his record of selective persecution and segregation, and his handling of the United States entering World War I. Regardless of where one may fall in their opinions, Woodrow Wilson was a very complex man. Who was the real Woodrow Wilson? Why is he such a controversial figure? What were his greatest failures? What were his greatest successes?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born around midnight on December 28th or 29th, 1856, depending upon the sources, in Staunton, Virginia. His mother was from England, and she was the daughter of a minister. His father, Joseph Ruggles Wilson, was a Presbyterian minister, and during the American Civil War, he served as a chaplain in the Confederate Army and used his church as a hospital for wounded soldiers. Growing up, he was known as Tommy Wilson, spending much of his youth in Augusta, Georgia, and Columbia, South Carolina. He was considered a rather slow student due to having dyslexia, and he did not learn to read until he was 10 years old. Wilson later did well in school and graduated from the College of New Jersey, later renamed Princeton University, in 1879, and then attended law school at the University of Virginia. In 1885, Wilson married Ellen Axon, a minister's daughter from Georgia, and they had 3 daughters. Ellen died of kidney disease in 1914 during Woodrow's first term as president. He practiced law in Atlanta, Georgia, and received a Ph.D. in political science from Johns Hopkins University in 1886. In fact, he is the only president to have ever earned a doctorate. He taught at Bryn Mawr College and Wesleyan College before being hired by Princeton in 1890 as a professor of jurisprudence and politics. Wilson published a very revisionist 5-volume textbook series in 1902 titled The History of the American People. In his books, he romanticized the Confederacy during the Civil War and described the Ku Klux Klan as roving knights errant, an invisible empire of the South, bound together in a loose organization to protect the Southern country of some of the ugliest hazards of a time of revolution. From 1902 to 1910, Wilson was president of Princeton, where he developed a reputation for his educational reform policies. However, during his tenure as president of that university, he also prevented the enrollment of black students. It was at this time that he entered politics and became the governor of New Jersey in 1910, ensuring that segregation was maintained. In 1912, the Democrats nominated Wilson for president, selecting the governor of Indiana, Thomas Marshall, as his vice presidential running mate. Revisionist historians have labeled Wilson a progressive Democrat who believed in the power of the federal government to expose corruption, regulate the economy, eliminate unethical business practices, and improve the general condition of society, and much of that is true. But he was also well known as a staunch segregationist and did not want blacks intermingling with whites, nor did he believe that blacks needed an education as they were basically an agrarian and hard labor workforce. Conservative Republican renominated President William Howard Taft, while the progressive wing of the GOP broke off to form the Progressive or Bull Moose Party and nominated Theodore Roosevelt, who had previously served as president from 1901 to 1909. With the Republicans divided, Wilson, who campaigned on a platform of liberal reform, won 435 electoral votes, compared to 88 for Roosevelt and 8 for Taft. He garnered nearly 42% of the popular vote. Roosevelt came in second place with more than 27% of the popular vote. Following the death of his first wife, Wilson married Edith Bowling Galt, a widow whose husband had owned a Washington, D.C. jewelry business, making her the new First Lady. Shortly after becoming president, Wilson resegregated many branches of the federal workforce, excluding blacks from employment. This flies in the face of current revisionist liberals claiming that he pursued an ambitious agenda of progressive reform. One major feat was when he established the Federal Reserve and Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Reserve situation was an effort to manage national banks and local banks whose cash reserves could be depleted, and they could replace the cash reserves by selling stocks and bonds or by borrowing from other sources, such as borrowing from China in recent history, or by calling in existing loans. Since there was no depositor's insurance, if it was believed that a bank was having cash flow problems, it was feared that people might make a run on the banks and remove their money. Over time, the chairman of the Reserve, known as the Fed, has become one of the most powerful forces in American government, able to raise and lower interest rates to adjust for economic changes such as inflation and recession. But they do not mention the fact that he was a strong supporter of the Ku Klux Klan, which assisted in his getting many Southern Democrat conservative votes in both of his elections. He also appointed many Southern Democrats to cabinet positions. In fact, Wilson was so enamored with the 1915 D.W. Griffith silent film, Birth of a Nation, that heralded the KKK as modern knights salvaging the honor of the Old South, as well as preserving the virtue of white women, that he held a private showing in the White House for friends, family, and cabinet members. African Americans in the film were played mostly by white actors in blackface, and they were portrayed as brutes. After the private screening in the White House with cabinet members and their families, Wilson is reported to have said, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." Later, he reportedly called the film an unfortunate production and hoped the film would not be shown in black communities. In 1913, Wilson managed to pass the 16th Amendment, which created the Internal Revenue Service. The Underwood-Simmons Act, which reduced tariffs, which was looked upon as a violation of the 10th Amendment, where states' rights mandated that the individual states would levy taxes upon their citizens and establish tariffs and then submit those collective revenues to the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Wilson also had the 17th Amendment passed, which altered the way senators from states were appointed to Washington, D.C. No longer were senators appointed by state legislatures. They were now elected by the voters directly. The following year, 1914, Europe was at war, a conflict that soon engulfed most of the nations in the world, divided into two camps. The Allies, to include France, Great Britain, and its empire, to include the Commonwealth nations of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, Imperial Russia, Italy, Romania, and Japan. Against the Central Powers, representing the empires of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. It is also claimed that Wilson tried to keep the United States neutral during World War I until he called upon Congress to declare war on Germany in 1917. This is a fallacy, and here is why. Historians friendly to Wilson cite the events that propelled his opinion to enter into World War I, such as the sinking of the Lusitania on May 7, 1915. And 761 people survived out of the 1,266 passengers and 696 crew on board, and 128 of the casualties were American citizens. If this were in fact the case, then why would Wilson wait 2 years to ask Congress for a declaration of war? Another event that is touted as his justification to enter the war was the notorious Zimmerman telegram. To quote Encyclopedia Britannica, the telegram was sent January 16, 1917, by German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German minister in Mexico. The note revealed a plan to renew unrestricted submarine warfare and to form an alliance with Mexico and Japan if the United States declared war on Germany. The message was intercepted by the British and passed on to the United States. Its publication caused outrage and contributed to the U.S. entry into World War I. Even Wilson and his closest confidants did not take the telegram seriously. For one reason, it was believed by a few people that the telegram was a British invention to lure the United States into the war due to the incredible cost in Allied lives and the stagnant condition on the Western Front, which may be true. But no one in the U.S. government saw Mexico as a threat to the United States, despite the previous raids by the Mexican bandit Pancho Villa. It was well known that the U.S. Army was vastly superior in numbers and quality, more than adequate to stop a Mexican invasion should it occur. The other factor was Germany's decision to publicly announce unrestricted submarine warfare in order to prevent war material and supplies from reaching England. The Lusitania, a privately owned civilian luxury liner, was also proven to have been carrying war material to Britain in violation of the Neutrality Act and international law, according to the Hague Convention of 1907. So why did we enter World War I? Wilson had campaigned on an isolationist policy regarding the World War as he ran for a second term, which was well received nationwide. Yet, behind closed doors, the wealthy businessmen who had him elected and then funded his re-election wanted to cash in on that support. Wilson ran for his second term on a public program of maintaining segregation, isolationism regarding not getting involved in the war in Europe, and he had the financial support of the greatest industrialists of his day, such as oil baron John Davison Rockefeller Sr., steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, global investment banker John Pierpont Morgan Sr., automobile manufacturer and anti-Semite Henry Ford, automobile manufacturer Williams C. Durant, New York Tammany Hall boss Charles Murphy, mining millionaire Daniel Guggenheim, railroad fortune heir Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, and rubber manufacturer Harvey Samuel Firestone Sr. But why would the richest men in the United States, if not the world, support a president who would not publicly support their interests overseas? These wealthy men had invested much of their wealth in Europe business and ventures and banks. All of these men had much of their fortunes tied up in European, Asian, and African business deals. In fact, Firestone, Durant, and Ford were desperate for their business's survival due to the Belgian Congo. The world's largest supplier of rubber was in danger of being taken over by Germany as the war was raging on that continent. It was quite clear to them that if Germany won the war, most of them would risk going bankrupt. Only an American intervention to secure final victory would save their fortunes. The wealth of his friends meant more to Wilson than American lives. The answer was simple. Wilson lied in his bid for a second term. He had every intention of getting involved in the war due to the pressure being applied by the men who got him elected twice. Wilson just needed a good reason to break his public promise. Again, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, Wilson was reluctant to break diplomatic relations with Germany, but, yielding to public clamor and senatorial advice, he severed those ties on February 3, 1917. While announcing the break in a speech to Congress, he voiced the fervent hope that the Germans would not, by sinking American ships, compel the United States to adopt belligerent measures. Wilson knew quite well that American ships were not to enter the declared war zone around the British Isles and coastal France. Germany had made it quite clear that all ships would be in danger if they did so. In fact, Germany specifically stated that American ships should avoid the war zone as to not create a diplomatic situation. By making that public statement even before the Lusitania sailed for Britain, Germany was in total compliance with international and maritime law. They had set out the conditions and locations allowing neutral nations to avoid direct contact. Wilson then decided to pay his political benefactors back and go to war. but soon afterward, Wilson had another major issue to deal with, again citing the Miller Center. The war was also triggered by a massive movement called the Great Migration of 500,000 African Americans out of the rural South to northern and Midwestern cities. For example, the black population in Cleveland, Ohio soared by more than 300%. Detroit's grew by 600%, Chicago's by 150%. And it was not only the opportunity for war industry jobs that attracted Southern blacks to northern cities. Many young black males left, enraged at the brutality of Southern racism, especially the lynchings that regularly occurred. Political disenfranchisement, debt peonage, prison chain gangs, and the boll weevil, insects that destroy cotton plants, left Southern blacks with little hope for a decent life after 1916. Under Wilson, Jim Crow policies were implemented, instituting segregated toilets, cafeterias, public transportation, schools, hospitals, and other whites-only buildings. Perhaps the most telling account regarding Wilson's racist attitude came from his own lips. Quoting Wilson, "Segregation is not a humiliation but a benefit, and ought to be so regarded by you gentlemen," he said during a meeting with civil rights leader William Monroe Trotter in November 1914. He then threw Trotter out of the White House. But Wilson did have a few accomplishments, which included child labor laws, an 8-hour day of work for railroad workers, and government loans to farmers. Additionally, Wilson nominated the first Jewish person to the U.S. Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis, who was confirmed by the Senate in 1916. After the war, he helped to negotiate a peace treaty that included a plan for the League of Nations. Although the U.S. Senate rejected U.S. membership in the League, Wilson received the Nobel Prize for his peacemaking efforts. Wilson, to his credit, saw the Treaty of Versailles as a very bad decision by the victorious European allies, hence his creating his 14 points. He understood that making Germany sign the war guilt clause for starting the war, which was itself a lie, as the war started between Austria-Hungary and Russia over the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip. The Senate voted on the Treaty of Versailles first in November 1919 and again in March 1920. Both times it failed to gain the two-thirds vote required for ratification. The United States never joined. Wilson also had major problems with labor unions. Again quoting the Miller Center, "The war years witnessed dramatic changes in the American workplace as the nation achieved nearly full employment. Thousands of workers joined unions, bolstered by Wilson's support for collective bargaining. At the end of the war in 1919, 3,300 strikes involving 4 million workers rocked the nation. Racial tensions were growing as many northern whites resented the Negro invasion. They claimed that poor blacks from the South were taking away their jobs for lower wages, which still far exceeded what they earned down South. Wilson, to his credit, denounced lynching, but he did nothing to protect blacks with enforcing existing federal laws or introducing new ones. He oversaw the introduction and enforcement of segregation into the federal civil service, and the result was a deep decline in the number of federal jobs held by African Americans. At the end of his second term in 1920, enough states ratified the 19th Amendment to give women the right to vote, and thus enable millions of new women voters to cast ballots in the presidential election. The majority voted for Republican Warren Harding. Wilson, although originally opposed to female suffrage, accepted a plank in the 1916 Democratic platform endorsing it and became a strong supporter by 1918. He reluctantly supported the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture and consumption of alcohol, but he vetoed on technical grounds the Volstead Act passed by Congress to enforce it. Congress later overrode his veto. On the night of September 25, 1919, on a train bound for Wichita, Kansas, Wilson collapsed from mental and physical stress, and the rest of his tour was canceled. On October 2, 1919, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. Wilson's condition was kept largely hidden from the public, and his wife worked behind the scenes to fulfill a number of his administrative duties. After leaving office in March 1921, Woodrow Wilson resided in Washington, D.C. He and a partner established a law firm, but poor health prevented the president from ever doing any serious work. Wilson died at his home on February 3, 1924, at age 67. He was buried in the Washington National Cathedral, the only president to be interred in the nation's capital. Every president leaves their indelible mark upon history, positive or negative. Whether they had foreign or domestic policy successes or failures, their actions have often long-term effects far beyond their lifetime. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was perhaps the most important president, if not world leader, during the 20th century due to the U.S. involvement in World War II, but his legacy started long before that conflict, and his decisions helped shape the post-war world. Who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Why is he controversial, and should he be? What decisions made by FDR still shape American society and the world today?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Franklin Roosevelt was born on January 30, 1882, in Hyde Park, New York, as the only child of James and Sarah Delano Roosevelt, and the fifth cousin to President Theodore Roosevelt. He was privately educated with tutors at home until age 14, at which time he entered Groton Preparatory School in Groton, Massachusetts. In 1900, he entered Harvard University, where he met Theodore Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor Roosevelt, an activist in charitable organizations assisting the poor in New York City. They became engaged during FDR's senior year, and they were married on March 17, 1905. FDR graduated from Harvard, but he was not a stellar student. He did, however, manage to get accepted into the Columbia University Law School, but was again not a standout student. After passing the New York bar exam, he went to work as a clerk for the distinguished Wall Street firm of Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn, but he did not seem to enjoy his work. His interest in politics saw him encouraged to run for the New York Senate race in 1910 as a Democrat, but he waited to see if his more famous Republican cousin, Theodore, would campaign against him. He won the election at age 29 and became rather well known nationally by leading Democrats in their opposition to Billy Sheehan, the Democrat candidate for the United States Senate backed by Tammany Hall. 3 months after the protest started, Tammany Democrats switched to another candidate. He was a strong supporter of Woodrow Wilson's bid for the presidency in 1912, as FDR also won his own re-election despite being afflicted with typhoid fever. He was unable to campaign, but he had the support of Albany journalist Lewis McHenry Howe, who stomped for him. Wilson was not one to forget his supporters, and he made FDR Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913 directly under the SecNav, Josephus Daniels. After U.S. entry into the war in 1917, which FDR supported, he became known as an effective administrator. In 1918, he embarked on an extended tour of naval bases and battlefields overseas, assessing conditions, taking notes, and making recommendations. When he returned, Eleanor had learned that FDR had an affair with her social secretary, Lucy Mercer. Eleanor asked for a divorce, but FDR declined and promised to never see Mercer again, although he would break that promise over the years. The rest of their marriage was one of political image and convenience. Roosevelt won the nomination for vice president at the 1920 Democratic Convention on the ticket with presidential nominee James M. Cox. Roosevelt, following Wilson's lead, campaigned for America to join the League of Nations, but the Democrats lost in a landslide to Republican Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Roosevelt then left politics and became vice president of a bonding company, Fidelity and Deposit Company of Maryland, as well as working on other businesses. In August 1921, while on vacation at Campobello Island, New Brunswick, Canada, FDR was stricken with poliomyelitis, and he was almost completely paralyzed. His mother suggested that he go to the family estate at Hyde Park, but Eleanor and Howe convinced him to stay politically active. Eleanor Roosevelt became an effective public speaker and very learned in the fine details of politics, keeping FDR's image alive in the public forum. In 1924, FDR appeared at the Democratic Convention and nominated Governor Alfred E. Smith of New York for president, and again at the 1928 convention. Smith convinced FDR to run for governor of New York in 1928. Roosevelt was at first very reluctant, but he eventually agreed. On Election Day, Roosevelt won by 25,000 votes, despite New York State turning Republican in the presidential election after Herbert Hoover's landslide victory in the 1928 election over Smith. Not long after becoming governor of New York, the stock market crashed. It would become a global event under the Hoover administration. October 28, 1929, known as Black Monday, the global economy took a nosedive as stocks fell 13% on that day, and it only got worse. There were several reasons why this happened. The economy after World War I was pretty good, and people began living on a credit economy where they purchased cars, appliances, and other items on a time payment plan. According to University of California at Irvine economics professor Gary Richardson, quote, "The war had eliminated a lot of the cooperation between nations that were required to run the international financial system. While that greater worldwide public consumption method created a lot of wealth for business owners, it also made them vulnerable to sudden shifts in consumer confidence. There was great competition between various industrialized nations as they manufactured and sold items on the global market. Some nations were unable to compete on a level playing field, and borrowing money became the norm. National currencies lost value as a result. Trade protectionists in Congress enacted the Smoot-Hawley Act, which was written in early 1929, while the economy still seemed to be going strong. But after the Wall Street crash weakened the economy, President Hoover still signed it into law in 1930. The law raised U.S. tariffs by an average of 16% in an effort to shield American factories from the competition with foreign countries' lower-priced goods, especially steel. But the move backfired when other countries put tariffs on U.S. exports. Many people believed that they could get rich quick by making risky investments, at home and abroad, and con men rose to the occasion. Shady land deals and fake oil speculators stole the money from people desperate to get rich, which continued for several years. But the greatest risks were on Wall Street. Investors increasingly bought stocks on margin, meaning they often put around 10% down on the price of a stock to buy it and then borrowed the balance of the value of that stock to pay for it, using the stock itself as collateral. Corporate stocks soared, and brokers made huge commissions. The Federal Reserve System, created in 1913 by Woodrow Wilson, was supposed to ensure the nation's economic stability by controlling the money supply. Yet it not only failed to stop the Great Depression, but it actually may have helped to cause it. The Fed was concerned about too much cash flowing in the markets, and they put the brakes on, according to Richardson. They got the stock market to come down, but then it came down a lot, and then it came down very quickly. Professor Daniel J. Smith, director of the Political Economy Research Institute at Middle Tennessee State University, stated, "There was a drastic 67% increase in the money supply between 1921 and 1929. It also led to unchecked speculation and the formation of a bubble in the stock market. Normally, overinvestment would lead to rising interest rates, which would act as a natural brake to prevent a bubble from forming. This didn't occur due to the easy monetary policies of the young Fed." After the crash, people began to trade their paper dollars for gold, as the dollar was based on the gold standard. In 2004, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke stated, "As a result, the Fed raised interest rates higher to protect the dollar's value, but those high interest rates made it difficult for businesses to borrow the money they needed to survive, and many ended up closing their doors instead." As a result, by the time FDR became president, the unemployment rate peaked in 1933 at 25.6%, meaning almost 26% of American workers found themselves unemployed. Meanwhile, FDR, as the governor of New York, wanted his own staff, and his dismissal of those who were recommended by Smith caused a rift in their relationship. During his first term, FDR realized and wisely concentrated on tax relief for farmers and cheaper public utilities. The popularity of his program saw him reelected in 1930 by 725,000 votes. The Great Depression saw FDR move much further to the political left, mobilizing the state government to provide relief and to aid in economic recovery. In the fall of 1931, he persuaded the Republican-dominated legislature to establish the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, which eventually provided unemployment assistance to 10% of New York's families. The downside was he knew that taxes had to be raised to pay for it, focusing upon those of his own upper class who were in the minority. FDR's socialist approach of tax and spend saw him become the frontrunner Democratic presidential nominee in 1932, but the conservative Democrats would be a problem, and the nominee needed 2/3 of the convention votes. The Democrat Speaker of the House of Representatives, John Nance Garner of Texas, won the California Democratic primary. But on the third ballot at the 1932 convention, Garner released his delegates to FDR, securing the required 2/3 vote on the fourth ballot. Garner received the vice presidential nomination. Not following tradition, FDR appeared in person to accept his party's nomination. In his speech to the delegates, he said, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. The American people struggling with the Great Depression decided that FDR's ambiguous promises, where he admitted that the federal government would have to take control, were considered far better than Hoover's previous policies. Ironically enough, at the same time, another man in Germany was offering the same package to his people, suffering from high unemployment and economic collapse. His name was Adolf Hitler. Both men had very similar platforms. Roosevelt created a team of advisors, popularly known as the Brain Trust. He promised aid to farmers, public development of electric power, a balanced budget, and a government policing of irresponsible private economic power, same as Hitler did. Roosevelt received nearly 23 million popular votes to Hoover's nearly 16 million. The electoral vote was 472 to 59, and Americans elected substantial Democratic majorities to both houses of Congress. But FDR was watching Europe. In Germany, for example, out of 52 political parties, 33% of the German people voted for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. They also promised jobs, education, rebuilding the military, and massive public work projects, just like FDR, who kept abreast of these events. And Hitler, unlike FDR, did so without the hindrance of a Congress or Supreme Court. Germany started implementing their programs right away. In order to help the nation, the outgoing President Hoover sought his successor Roosevelt's cooperation in stemming the deepening economic crisis. But FDR refused his proposals, which made sense. But Hoover himself admitted it would mean the abandonment of 90% of the so-called New Deal. But FDR would have to do some serious cutting to some spending in some areas and raise taxes to pay for his ambitious New Deal. One project that he did not cut was perhaps the most controversial in American history. One dark reality that seems to have evaded most historians was the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. This was a government-funded project that began in 1932 and could have been one of the needless programs that FDR could have had defunded, but he did not. It began with 600 African-American men in Macon County, Alabama, being enrolled in the project, which aimed to study the full progression of the disease. 399 of these men had syphilis, and a control group of 201 others were free of the disease. These participants, really guinea pigs, were primarily poor and mostly illiterate sharecroppers. Many of them had never seen a doctor in their entire lives. Doctors from the U.S. Public Health Service ran the study, and they informed the participants that they were being treated for, quote, bad blood, a commonly used euphemism in the area at that time to refer to a variety of ailments. To make matters worse, the government researchers and doctors told the local doctors to not treat these infected men so as to allow the study to continue, and as men went blind, insane, and died, the government performed autopsies for their research. That program ran in secret until 1972, until it was stopped by the Nixon administration. Now remember that similar types of experiments had been conducted by the Japanese Unit 731 and also the Germans, and they later put many German doctors in the docks at Nuremberg after World War II, and some were executed or served prison sentences. FDR seemed to have no problem with it letting just continue, but also accelerate. Then the economy took another nosedive. By Inauguration Day on March 4th, 1933, most banks were still open after 1939, but they closed. Industrial production had fallen to just 56% of its 1929 level. At least 13 million workers were unemployed, and companies lost 89% or more of their pre-depression value. Due to the lack of global hard currency, American farmers did not have markets to sell to. FDR, in order to placate the masses, gave a radio address stating, "This great nation will endure, as it has endured, will revive and prosper." He asserted, adding, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He never said how he would implement, let alone pay for it. In his first 100 days, or the first phase of the New Deal, his administration presented Congress with a variety of proposals intended to promote economic recovery and provide relief to the millions of poor and unemployed. FDR planned to reform those aspects of the economy that he believed had caused the financial collapse. Roosevelt was at very least open in admitting that the New Deal was experimental and that he would make adjustments after observing what worked and what failed. He would have to cut funding and spending in some areas to support paying for his planned projects, on top of taxing the wealthy and corporations very heavily. His first decision on this issue was to order all banks closed, regardless of solvency, to stop depositors from taking out their money, which he believed would topple the entire banking system. The bank holiday, as it was called, combined with the emergency banking legislation and the first of Roosevelt's regular national radio broadcasts, later known as fireside chats, so restored public confidence that when banks did reopen, the much-feared runs did not materialize. Regarding handling the Depression, two of FDR's primary actions were the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was charged with increasing prices of agricultural commodities and expanding the proportion of national income going to farmers. Its strategy was to grant subsidies to producers of 7 basic commodities: wheat, corn, hogs, cotton, tobacco, rice, and milk in return for reduced production, thereby reducing the surpluses that kept commodity prices low. The subsidies were to be generated from taxes on the selling of these commodities, but in 1936, the Supreme Court struck the tax down. To get around this, FDR changed the focus of the AAA to soil conservation, but the socialist enforced principle of paying farmers not to grow certain crops to raise their value at the expense of the consumer would remain American agricultural policy for the next 6 decades. The greatest controversy of the AAA was that it required destroying newly planted fields at a time when many Americans were going hungry. But that was not FDR's concern. He wanted tax dollars. Over time, the income of farmers' income did rise, as did their taxes, but people were being starved as a result of less produce being available on the markets. It would take until 1941 for farming incomes to return to the still abysmal levels of pre-Depression 1929. The other program was the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, which was a 2-part program consisting of a $3.3 billion appropriation for public works to be spent by the Public Works Administration. Had this money been quickly moved into the economy, it would have provided almost immediate relief and stimulated a temporary recovery. But FDR wanted to be sure the program would not invite fraud and waste, so instead of placing an oversight committee, the PWA moved very slowly, and it did not become relevant until late into the New Deal program. The other part of the NIRA was the National Recovery Administration, responsible for establishing and administering industry-wide codes prohibiting unfair trade practices, establishing minimum wages and maximum working hours, guaranteeing workers the rights to collective bargaining, and imposing price controls and regulating production. These codes were complex and difficult to enforce, and by 1935, the business community had become fed up with the program and blamed Roosevelt for its failure. In May, the Supreme Court invalidated the National Recovery Administration, which by that time had lost the majority of its support in both Congress and the administration. Perhaps the most famous of his programs was the Tennessee Valley Authority, a public corporation created in 1933 to build dams and hydroelectric power plants and to improve navigation and flood control in the vast Tennessee River Basin. Ironically, Hitler started the same projects in the Ruhr Valley once he put German coal and industry back in German hands, which reduced German unemployment by almost 25%, not to include the Autobahn project and industrialization. Roosevelt knew that this was a violation of the Treaty of Versailles, but Great Britain and France were in no position to enforce it. The TVA, like Hitler's Ruhr Valley project, eventually provided cheap electricity to impoverished areas in 7 states along the river and its tributaries, reignited a long-standing debate over the proper role of government in the development of the nation's natural resources. The constitutionality of the agency was challenged immediately after its establishment, but it was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1936. The 100 Days program also included relief to include short-term payments to individuals to alleviate hardship and reform measures supporting long-range programs aimed at eliminating economic abuses. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration granted funds to state relief agencies, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, much like Germany's Reich Labor Service, employed hundreds of thousands of young men in reforestation and flood control work. The Homeowners Refinancing Act provided mortgage relief for millions of unemployed Americans in danger of losing their homes. The Federal Securities Act provided government oversight of stock trading, which later became the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, which prohibited commercial banks from making risky investments to corporations unless the government approved and established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to protect depositors' accounts up to certain individual amounts. By the fall of 1934, FDR's efforts provided a slight recovery, giving Americans hope. Although the New Deal had alienated conservatives, including many businessmen, most Americans supported Roosevelt's programs. That support manifested itself in the congressional elections of 1934, in which Democrats added to their already substantial majorities in both houses. As 1935 arrived, Roosevelt knew that he had to be more effective despite the economy having a slow rise. From 1932 to 33, it was still far below its level before the stock market crash of 1929. Unlike in Germany, millions of Americans were still unemployed, as Hitler did not have a political machine or Supreme Court that could challenge his plans. In both countries, millions had been jobless for several years. Desperate people will reach out to any savior for relief. In the U.S., millions of people criticized the New Deal for not going far enough. Roosevelt felt the public backlash and foresaw the real possibility that he could face a significant third-party primary challenge from the left in the 1936 election. FDR, who was not blind to the success Hitler was having in Germany, especially after repudiating the Treaty of Versailles and stopping reparations payments which crippled Germany, he himself asked Congress to pass the Second New Deal in 1935. FDR's primary effort of the Second New Deal was the Social Security Act in 1935. The original U.S. legislation was to establish a permanent providing unemployment and disability insurance, as well as a national old age pension plan, a system through which the employer and employee contributions would be mutual. The system was later extended to include dependents, the disabled, and other groups. However, it was just another tax, a way to make more money fall into the government's hands and make it available for big government spending. People did not need the government taxing them and then telling them that they would have a retirement later. People already destroyed by the bank collapses were not depositing money in the banks after they reopened, as no savings accounts meant no capital, no money for the government to spend or banks to make risky investments. The next plans were the Works Progress Administration. The WPA was headed by FDR's close confidant, Harry Hopkins, and was designed to provide unemployed persons with useful job skills and work that would, quote, help to maintain their skills and bolster their self-respect. Ironically, Hitler started the same program at the same time. Between 1935 and 1941, it employed a monthly average of 2.1 million workers in the U.S. on a variety of projects, including the construction of roads, bridges, airports, and public buildings, natural resource conservation, and artistic and cultural programs such as painting public murals and writing local and regional histories. The Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act, reestablished the rights of workers for collective bargaining. This had been eliminated after the Supreme Court had invalidated the NRA. The National Labor Relations Board was created to adjudicate labor disputes. It was well received. However, FDR's actual feelings on this issue would come to light after various labor unions went on strike later, as seen in Part 2 of this series. Another major event was when Congress passed the Soap the Rich tax, raising tax rates for persons with large incomes and for large corporations. While hailed as a politically savvy move to assuage the common man, FDR's higher taxes on corporations meant that they were not able to afford hiring more unskilled labor. In 1935, Congress passed a series of laws, such as the Neutrality Act, designed to minimize American involvement with belligerent nations. FDR had to accept the neutrality laws because he knew that his veto would have been overridden by Congress. But he still consistently warned Americans of the dangers of remaining isolated from a world increasingly menaced by the dictatorial regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan. The isolationists, especially those in Congress who believed that American entry into World War I had been a great mistake, were determined to prevent the United States from being drawn into another war. Republicans waited to see what would happen overseas, and they waited to pounce on Roosevelt if he even entertained the thought of getting the country involved. FDR's re-election in 1936 had the support of the farmers, labor unions, and the poor. He faced the equally firm opposition of conservatives, but the political attacks he endured from the wealthy business owners, people of his own class, from the Republicans galvanized his supporters. Although FDR had refused to support international currency stabilization at the London Economic Conference in 1933, by 1936 he had stabilized the dollar and concluded stabilization agreements with Great Britain and France. Congress agreed with him to recognize the government of the new Soviet Union, launched the Good Neighbor policy to help improve U.S. relations with Latin America, and backed reciprocating trade agreements with several foreign countries. The Republican nominee, Governor Alfred M. Landon of Kansas, a political and economic moderate, received 16 million votes to FDR's almost 28 million, and Roosevelt carried every state except Maine and Vermont. In his second inaugural address, FDR said, "If I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished, I'll make amends." He assured the public that he was determined to implement further New Deal reforms. With large Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, the only thing stopping his pseudo-socialist agenda was the Supreme Court, which had ruled against several of his programs and was a serious challenge to the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act, both pending rulings. Well, FDR was not allowed to say much about the Supreme Court, and he was not about to let something as paltry as the U.S. Constitution or the Supreme Court be responsible for ensuring all legislation conformed to it stand in his way. In order to have a Supreme Court more user-friendly to his schemes, he tried the first attempt at what we now today call court packing. His plan would have allowed him to appoint one new justice for every sitting justice aged 70 years or older, and when the bill was proposed, it provoked heated debate in Congress and eventually was voted down, giving him his first major legislative defeat. But the court upheld both the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act, despite the fact that Social Security was yet another third tax on the people. But the United States had much to be proud of. The U.S. Olympic team had done well at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. FDR was so proud that he invited the entire Olympic team to the White House, all except the brightest star at the Games, four-time gold medalist and world record holder Jesse Owens. FDR never really hid his prejudice against blacks. He did nothing to stop segregation, whether in the government service started by Woodrow Wilson, the military, or even within society. By mid-1937, FDR decided that with the economy looking a little better, he would try and get a balanced budget, so he cut back government spending while maintaining high taxes. The sharp recession was a result, and the economy began a plunge back to what it was in 1932. This was not an unforeseen event. Many Republicans had consistently warned him about his New Deal roller coaster ride. So as a result, FDR was forced to finally listen to economic advisors from the other political party who counseled deficit spending as the best way to counter the Depression. Late in 1937, he backed another massive government spending program, and by the middle of 1938, the crisis had passed. Speaking in Chicago in October 1937, he proposed that, quote, peace-loving nations make concerted efforts to quarantine aggressors. His intention was to state that breaking off diplomatic relations was sufficient, but the way he said it caused even Democrat supporters to take a second look at him, and as a result, he had to walk back the comment on international interventions. Then, FDR had his first major challenge, when on December 12, 1937, the Japanese sank an American gunboat, the USS Panay on the Yangtze River in China. Many people were worried that the attack would lead FDR to ask Congress for a declaration of war, and they were pleased when Roosevelt accepted Japan's apologies. However, this would not be his last test. By 1938, the New Deal was almost over. Conservative Southern Democrats had openly opposed it, and FDR failed to defeat several of them in the 1938 Democratic primaries, and he was accused of being a dictator trying to conduct a purge. As a result of massive disaffection with his policies that hurt big business and did some little to help the poor, the Republicans gained 80 seats in the House and 7 in the Senate. Despite continued Democratic majorities in both houses, an unexpected alliance of Republicans and conservative Democrats prevented FDR from accomplishing anything in Congress. By 1939, FDR could not ignore foreign policy issues. One of his worst decisions cost a lot of lives when on May 13, 1939, the German liner St. Louis sailed from Hamburg, Germany to Havana, Cuba. The 937 passengers were mostly German and Austrian Jewish refugees, but also many Eastern European Jews and non-Jews, and most had visas for entry. Cuban President Federico Laredo Bru revoked the existing visas and refused to allow the ship to dock, but 28 passengers were allowed to disembark, and 22 of them had U.S. visas. Entry to Cuba now required written authorization from the Cuban Secretaries of State and Labor and the posting of a $500 bond, which was waived for U.S. tourists. This forced the ship to leave Cuban waters, and the United States and Canada were unwilling to admit the passengers, and Roosevelt personally denied the ship permission to dock when it was off the coast of Florida. He took a lot of pressure from Southern Democrats, and he knew he needed their votes in the upcoming election. A Fortune magazine poll at the time indicated that 83% of Americans were opposed to relaxing restrictions on immigration. Quotas established in the U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act of 1924 strictly limited the number of immigrants who could be admitted to the United States each year. In 1939, the annual combined German-Austrian immigration quota was 27,370, and that was quickly filled. In fact, there was a waiting list of at least several years, but Roosevelt could have intervened. The St. Louis passengers were finally permitted to land in Western European countries rather than return to Nazi Germany. Many of these passengers were then able to secure visas to the United States if they had family or sponsors, and they eventually survived. However, 254 of the passengers, many noted professors, doctors, lawyers, engineers, chemists, and their entire families, died in the Holocaust. FDR is often ignored on the SS St. Louis issue, but he was also dealing with global issues, such as the fact that Hitler repudiated the Treaty of Versailles, occupied the Ruhr, and militarized Germany, and after the failure of the Munich Agreement had taken Austria and Czechoslovakia. Japan had invaded China, and Japan and the Soviet Union had fought a war in Mongolia. Italy had invaded Albania, Ethiopia, and had annexed territories in Libya, with Benito Mussolini claiming the coastal provinces of Tripoli, Misrata, Benghazi, and Derna. And the Spanish Civil War had raged for 3 years in a proxy war between Hitler and Stalin, establishing a dictatorship under Francisco Franco. And China had been fighting a civil war between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. The world was changing, and not for the better, and FDR stayed abreast of foreign events, and it has been said that his New Deal programs were simply following Hitler's lead. And when Germany emerged by 1938 as a strong military power, much better off economically, the question was posed, why not here also? To answer that question would be another video. In Part 2, we will examine how the winds of war in Asia and Europe would shape FDR's foreign policy and see him violate international U.S. laws by executive action while possibly having the best of intentions. Welcome to part 2 of our examination of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where we continue his story as the world entered World War II and how FDR violated several laws to ensure that the United States became involved.
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Franklin Roosevelt knew that the United States needed to get into the Second World War in order to get the country completely out of the Great Depression. In April of 1933, he signed Executive Order 6102, confiscating all gold coins, bullion, and gold certificates from privately held concentrations in American hands. He basically stole gold and gave bottom-line dollar values on that money. None of his great schemes, as previously mentioned, had really improved the quality of life of American citizens. Unemployment was still high and the economy was on life support. Another great stain on his presidency was the fact that he was a staunch advocate of racial segregation in the military. He did nothing to alter the Jim Crow laws employed by various states, often in direct violation of federal law, especially on voting rights. It was only at the insistence of the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, an apparently far more enlightened person than the Department of the Army, who allowed the training of black pilots at Tuskegee, Alabama. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and following this, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. Roosevelt and Churchill planned on getting the U.S. into the war as soon as possible, as clearly stated in the telegram Churchill sent to FDR on October 5, 1939, regarding the American Navy extending their patrol zones 300 miles into the Atlantic, violating maritime and international law. Churchill hoped that American naval ships would patrol the entire western Atlantic as both escorts for fuel and munitions transports headed to Britain and report back on any German surface ship or U-boat activity, which was what FDR planned on doing. Churchill's correspondences went through U.S. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy Sr. through the U.S. Embassy, as opposed to first going through the British Foreign Office, which was a violation of protocol. Additionally, FDR agreed to loan the British 50 World War I era destroyers to assist with their anti-submarine efforts, with a deal to have U.S. naval assets placed in British possessions in the Caribbean and West Africa. Also, the U.S. was producing a moderate amount of war materiel, such as tanks, aircraft, guns, and ammunition, which were being sent to the United Kingdom in violation of neutrality laws, and the Germans knew it. The Lend-Lease proposal passed in Congress, but with the caveat that the U.S. could not display any overt support of the British should Japan attack their interests in Asia. On March 8, 1940, the Senate approved it. The act permitted Franklin Roosevelt to sell, lend, or lease munitions, aircraft, weapons, and military supplies to, quote, the government of any country whose defense the President deems vital to the defense of the United States. Great Britain was one of those countries. He also allowed the creation of the Eagle Squadrons, where American pilots would enlist in the Royal Air Force after being trained in Canada, unless they were already U.S. trained to help Britain, and many flew during the Battle of Britain. On March 19th, FDR received a request from Churchill for U.S. ships and aircraft to help locate the German cruisers Scharnhorst and Eisenach. The April 2nd FDR announcement was the increase in the American shipbuilding program and the placing of Americans in Iceland and Senegal, West Africa. At this time, he accelerated the building of oil tankers and merchantmen in aiding Britain, which would later support Stalin by running ships in convoys to Archangel and Murmansk, as well as supplies such as oil and gasoline, arms, and materiel through Persia for the Middle East campaign. In order to do this, FDR approved American destroyer escorts to provide security to the convoys headed to Europe. This was in fact beyond the scope of his legal authority without notifying Congress, not just in the fact that he was violating neutrality laws, but he was actively engaging American forces in direct combat. In April, FDR had dispatched American troops to Greenland with the permission of the Danish government, which controlled the island to keep it out of German hands and to provide protection for convoys ferrying material to Great Britain. FDR also illegally extended U.S. territorial waters all the way to Iceland to assist the British, in total violation of international laws. He wanted to get into the war against Germany at all costs, but due to the strong isolationist movement led by transatlantic air hero Charles Lindbergh, he needed a legitimate reason to ask Congress for a declaration of war. Therefore, he knowingly placed Americans in harm's way. And as a result, on September 4, 1941, U-652, commanded by Georg Werner Fratz, reportedly attacked the destroyer USS Greer, quote, without provocation, as she steamed alone toward Iceland. The official story was that Greer dodged 2 torpedoes and counterattacked with depth charges. As Roosevelt told the country, quote, the German submarine fired first upon this American destroyer without warning, and with deliberate design to sink her. What FDR lied to the public about was the fact that Greer was directed to the U-boat by British patrol aircraft, and the Greer attacked the U-boat first when it dropped depth charges in conjunction with the aircraft bombing, and both were equally ineffective, but the attack made it the first American ship to fire on a German vessel. In response, Roosevelt ordered the Navy to shoot on sight any Axis warship found in waters, quote, the protection of which is necessary for American defense. FDR wanted war, and he wanted it badly. A comparative analysis covers another naval clash a quarter of a century later, which would similarly help move the United States into a new war. As the facts of the Gulf of Tonkin incident also turned out to be different than what the president, Lyndon B. Johnson, said at the time, Senator J. William Fulbright would remark, quote, Roosevelt's deviousness in a good cause made it easier for Lyndon Johnson to practice the same kind of deviousness in a bad cause. The North Atlantic came within the scope of this order. Roosevelt's logic was simple. If you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he has struck before you crush him. Again, on October 17, 1941, the USS Kearney was torpedoed by U-568, commanded by Joachim Preuss, off the coast of Iceland as she went to the rescue of a 50-ship convoy in international waters. The U-boats had already torpedoed several merchant ships. The Kearney began dropping depth charges, a clear violation of neutrality, but survived the attack and reached port. It was later repaired and returned to duty, but 11 sailors were killed and 22 more injured. Hitler's torpedo, Roosevelt said, was directed at every American. But America did not go to war over this act of war. Even Roosevelt knew that the Kearney's attack on German submarines was a first strike that could have doomed his presidency. However, FDR was hoping that Germany would declare war as a result. In their correspondence from November 10th to 16th, Winston Churchill also wanted FDR to use his influence in convincing the Vichy French government to not hand over their ships to the Germans, and FDR offered to buy 2 new French battleships under construction as to not fall into German hands. That eventuality resulted in the sinking of the destroyer USS Reuben James as she escorted British convoy HX-156, with all ships flying the Union Jack, and were in effect legitimate targets. U-552, commanded by Erich Topp, was part of the Wolfpack shadowing the convoy. His orders were clear: sink all British shipping wherever it may be. Topp stated this in his own words during my personal interview with him. Topp said, quote, we had orders to prevent the American supplies from reaching England. We were sinking a lot of ships. We called this the happy time. We also knew that the Americans had given the British 50 old destroyers. It was common sense that if destroyers were escorting a British convoy, then they were also legitimate targets. On October 31st, 1941, at daybreak, Reuben James was about 600 miles west of Ireland and blacked out to avoid reflection in the inquisitive monocles of a U-boat periscope, as Newsweek put it. A torpedo fired by U-552 hit her on the port side, igniting her forward magazine, and blew her in half. Of the ship's crew, only 45 were saved. 99 sailors died, including all 7 of the ship's officers. The international fallout was almost immediate. A New York Times editorial said that the sinking brushes away the last possible doubt that the United States and Germany are now at open war in the Atlantic. The New York Times also printed, "The people, their representatives in Congress, and even high officials of the government are deeply divided on the subject." FDR knew that he was walking a fine line, and in fact he may have been concerned about impeachment proceedings being started as a result from the Republicans in Congress. But FDR had his supporters, such as Navy Secretary Frank Knox, stating the attack was worse than piracy, and Senator Alben Barkley of Kentucky, who accused the Germans of trying to drive us off the seas, and I don't believe the American people are ready to be driven off. Senator George Aiken of Vermont, however, said that Roosevelt was personally responsible for whatever lives may have been lost because he had ordered convoy duty. The Russian newspaper Pravda praised the United States for having taken its fighting post, and the London Daily Mail predicted that the United States was marching down the last mile to a declaration of war. The public German response was also immediate. Quote, "Anybody walking along the railroad tracks at night should not be surprised if they get run over by an express train." U.S. Senator Gerald P. Nye of North Dakota seemed to agree. He said, "You can't expect to walk into a barroom brawl and hope to stay out of the fight." Japanese officials were strangely silent. However, privately, Adolf Hitler was less than pleased at the incident, which was the third American ship attacked by his U-boats. Although none of these attacks were illegal under maritime law or the Geneva Convention of 1929, Hitler did not want the United States drawn into the war in Europe. According to SS Lieutenant General Karl Wolff, quote, "Hitler was quite upset at the sinking of the Reuben James. The other attacks had also disturbed him, but he understood what his U-boat commanders were up against, such as surviving attacks and proper warship identification. He did issue the order through Dönitz that all the commanders must make certain of their identification so as to not bring America into the war. On that he was most sincere and determined." What is of great interest is the fact that Reuben James was not flying the American ensign, according to Erich Topp, who said, "Whenever I saw a ship, we compared that to the International Registry, a book of silhouettes and details of every ship known to be afloat. The Americans giving the British destroyers only increased the attention to detail, and when I saw the Reuben James, it was a Clemson-class destroyer, older, and it was not flying the American flag. Also, it was protecting the British convoy, and it took aggressive action against us. I fired my torpedoes to protect my boat and to allow us to continue on our patrol." FDR would have to wait for a more tangible event to get the war he wanted. However, Roosevelt's interests were not just limited to Germany and the European War. Churchill had great concerns about Japan, which had invaded China years earlier and was in French Indochina and threatening British and Dutch colonies in Asia. Churchill wanted the same American support in the Indian Ocean as he did in the Atlantic, where the Japanese threat was growing. FDR had already been supplying Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces in China as he fought the Japanese in that country, often alongside Mao Zedong, who led the communist forces when they were not fighting each other. The American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers, were flying mercenaries who had been supporting Chiang flying out of Rangoon, Burma, and China, and were heavily involved in fighting the Japanese in the air and on the ground. But they were on the Kuomintang payroll, not the United States, as each pilot resigned his commission to fly for a foreign nation. But the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 changed everything into FDR's favor. The declaration of war against Japan was ratified by both houses of Congress, and Hitler stupidly declared war on the United States on December 11th. One of the major problems historians had with FDR was his ordering General MacArthur to abandon the Philippine Islands, while leaving General Jonathan M. Wainwright and his staff, along with 19 other American and 4 Filipino generals, with about 23,000 American military personnel and 100,000 Filipino soldiers who would be killed or captured. FDR also allowed the U.S. Navy assets, in particular 27 submarines, to withdraw to Australia without even trying to intervene. As America entered the war, unemployment was almost non-existent as the war industry exploded, and military conscription, as well as the millions of volunteers, swelled the ranks of the military. Now fighting in the Pacific as well as the North Atlantic, to his credit, FDR did the smartest thing any national leader could do. He allowed the military leadership to conduct the war while he handled foreign policy and the new alliance. Unlike Churchill, Hitler, Tojo, Mussolini, and Stalin, Roosevelt had faith in his military leadership. He at least knew his own limitations in that regard and relied upon his senior generals and admirals to conduct the war without his hands-on interference. His reliance upon George C. Marshall as Army Chief of Staff proved very sound. One of the least discussed issues was FDR authorizing the recruitment of the Italian Mafia in the war effort. From his new prison, mob boss Salvatore Luciana, better known as Lucky Luciano, still ran the longshoremen. His efforts prevented sabotage by Axis agents, and his men tracked down and reported on German and Italian spies in all the major port cities around the Northeast United States. In April 1942, John L. Lewis, president of the United Mine Workers, told President Roosevelt that due to unsafe working conditions, low pay, and lousy benefits, the coal miners would go on strike. The union demands included a basic wage increase, a guaranteed work week, pay for underground travel time, and double pay for Sunday work. An impasse was reached in the bargaining process, and after the operators had rejected a compromise proposal, the dispute was referred to the National War Labor Board. Roosevelt ordered Secretary of the Interior Harold L. Ickes to take over and operate all mines under federal authority, threatening the miners with prison and fines. The miners were less than impressed. In response, on May 1, 1943, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9340, which placed coal mines under the control of the federal government. But even with the mines now under government operation, the miners continued to fight. At Roosevelt's urging, Congress passed legislation on May 6, 1943, making it a crime to instigate a strike in war plants or mines that had been taken over by the government. Those who challenged it were prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Roosevelt threatened to call out the troops unless miners returned to work, but miners merely shrugged it off and proclaimed what would become their classic phrase, "You can't dig coal with bayonets." Negotiations continued, and the miners returned to work under the new terms, and in November 1943, they eventually won wage increases and pay for travel from the shaft head to the coalface. However, despite the fact that he did make some very bad decisions as the war went on, one of his better decisions was working with Churchill on the Casablanca Directive, named for the Casablanca Conference held in Morocco in January 1943. This was revised as the Point Blank Directive on June 14, 1943, which prioritized the targets to be bombed in Europe to impede Axis war-making potential. Focusing upon critical factors such as petroleum facilities, U-boat and shipbuilding facilities, aircraft manufacturing, ball bearings, etc., the strategic bombing plan was set up in conjunction with Royal Air Force Bomber Command. He also gave U.S. Army Air Force commanders latitude to select their targets based upon mission viability, weather, and the availability of fighter escort aircraft, which at that time was minimal. The war at sea fell to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King, who had good leaders under him in the Pacific with Admirals Chester Nimitz, William Halsey, and others, working with the contentious and often imperious Army General Douglas MacArthur. Roosevelt and Churchill decided that Europe was the primary focus, so the bulk of the resources would be deployed to fight Hitler and Mussolini. The Pacific and Asian theaters would be dealt with in due time and with a slower forward momentum. Being, as it was an island-hopping campaign, getting U.S. forces closer to being able to bomb Japan directly. Some of the controversial decisions FDR approved of have come to light. For example, Army Lieutenant General Mark Clark's decision to take Rome by bypassing German troops was actually a plan submitted by South African Field Marshal Jan Christian Smuts. Churchill and FDR agreed that Italian morale, while very low, was not sufficient to expect a mass surrender of their forces unless they lost their capital. In this vein, Clark's decision was considered sound, as the Italian government did in fact surrender on September 8, 1943. One of the best decisions in history was FDR facilitating the Manhattan Project, the secret development of the atomic bombs under Major General Leslie Groves, and the recruitment of the best and brightest nuclear physicists and engineers in the world. In another display of proper decision-making by FDR, he kept his hands out of the planning for the invasion of France, allowing the Allied Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in Europe, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, to plan the D-Day invasion with his general staff, which hastened the end of the war. It was well known in many circles that FDR had a soft spot for Stalin and the Communists. Even his Vice President Harry S. Truman could not understand this affectation. The same could be said of all of the senior military commanders. As stated by Army General Matthew Ridgway, quote, "The special feelings Roosevelt had for Stalin were beyond my comprehension, as well as that of many others. He totally disbelieved the evidence that the Russians had been behind the Katyn massacre, and he still blamed the Germans for it. This despite the evidence and the testimonies of Poles who escaped and managed to make it to England." FDR also capitulated to Stalin at the Yalta Conference in 1945, where he and Churchill joined the dictator to discuss the post-war condition of Europe. Stalin agreed to hold free and fair elections in Eastern Europe. Of course, Roosevelt believed Stalin and took him at his word, whereas Churchill never believed him for a minute. Pamela Churchill Harriman also had her own perspective. Being married to the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, she stated, quote, "Avril was quite gobsmacked that Roosevelt did not insist in writing that Stalin guaranteed the free elections after the war. But then again, he said, Stalin would not have kept his word anyway, and Winston knew it, as did I." In essence, FDR caved into almost every demand Stalin made, to include the demand that all Soviet citizens, civilians, or prisoners of war in German hands be handed over to him. Churchill knew what that would mean, and he resisted. But FDR held all the cards and the purse strings. There was still a war in Asia to be won. FDR's failure to stand up to Stalin may have had less to do with his acceptance of the communist and more to do with his failing health and declining mental sharpness. Regardless of the reason, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was single-handedly the one man above all others who helped establish the Cold War, depending upon which hypotheticals you believe. The switching of Eastern Europe from one dictator to another that Churchill feared was set in motion. Roosevelt had been in obviously declining health for a number of years. A March 1944 examination by his doctors revealed a variety of heart ailments, high blood pressure, and bronchitis. Those close to the president, even those who saw him speak in public, noted his haggard and weak appearance, his flagging energy, and his increasing lapses of concentration and memory. Most of the American public was unaware of these ailments, although rumors about his health were rampant. FDR delivered a few important speeches in 1944 that quieted many of these concerns. Nonetheless, Roosevelt's election victory over Thomas E. Dewey in 1944, in addition to the war and the Yalta Conference the following February, put him under immense strain. In April 1945, FDR returned to Warm Springs, Georgia, a destination that had served since the 1920s as his favorite retreat. There, on April 12th, while sitting for a portrait, he collapsed and died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Vice President Harry Truman took the oath of office the same day. Perhaps Roosevelt's most lasting international legacy, along with First Lady Eleanor and Winston Churchill, was the establishment of the United Nations, which had ambitious and honorable ambitions, if not a tainted history of failure thereafter. In April 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt died in office, and his vice president, Harry S. Truman, took the oath of office. Truman continued with the mission of winning World War II and handling the alliance fighting in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. But, unlike his predecessor, he saw a different and equally dangerous world coming when that conflict was over. Unlike FDR, Truman was not enamored with the communist world, and his presidency would establish that fact. Who was Harry S. Truman? What made him effective but also controversial as a president? What situations did he handle well and which ones did he not? What were considered his failures? What were considered his successes?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Harry S. Truman was born on May 8, 1884, in Lamar, Missouri. Truman was known for wanting to have things his way, but he also listened to advice from those he trusted, but he could be ruthless against those he did not. Truman briefly attended Spalding's Commercial College after high school, but discontinued. He was the only president since William McKinley to have never earned a college degree. Truman could not afford college, so he applied to West Point, but his eyesight prevented acceptance. He joined the Missouri National Guard in 1905 and served until 1911 in the Kansas City-based Battery B, 2nd Missouri Field Artillery, reaching the rank of corporal. As the U.S. entered World War I, Truman was sent for training to Camp Donovan, Fort Sill near Lawton, Oklahoma, when his regiment was federalized as the 129th Field Artillery. Due to his aptitude, he was appointed as a first lieutenant, and Truman was promoted to captain effective April 23rd as his unit shipped out for France, and in July, he became commander of Battery D, 129th Field Artillery, 35th Division. When in combat, Truman ignored his standing orders to not fire on targets unless ordered to do so, and was limited in his field of fire. But when he saw a German artillery unit, he saw it as an opportunity and had his battery fire, destroying the German guns, attacking the 28th Division. Upon returning home, he opened a haberdashery in Kansas City, Missouri. He was elected as a judge of Jackson County in 1922 despite not being a lawyer, but he did have a successful business venture. Truman was then elected to the United States Senate from Missouri in 1934. As a senator, Truman opposed both Nazi Germany and Communist Russia, but empathized with the Western Europeans under German occupation. 2 days after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, on June 22, 1941, Truman said, "If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia, and if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And that way, let them kill as many as possible, although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances." Between 1940 and 1944, he gained national prominence as chairman of the Truman Committee, which was aimed at reducing waste and inefficiency in wartime contracts, which FDR, who was not a real fan of Truman, saw as a critical effort. FDR chose Truman to run as his VP in his last election as he was considered an acceptable moderate. It was only after FDR's death and Truman assumed the presidency that he was even informed about the ongoing Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb by General Leslie Groves. Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration demanding the unconditional surrender of the Japanese government, warning of prompt and utter destruction. 11 days later, on August 6, 1945, having received no reply, he ordered the first bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, With no surrender, he ordered the second bomb dropped on Nagasaki. These two decisions have been considered the most controversial decisions in presidential history. In 1945, Truman asked Congress to raise taxes to create a national health care system, which was not well received, and it was killed by Republican Senator Robert Taft's Taft-Smith-Ball bill, which would allow states to make health care private. When Republicans regained control of the House in 1946, Truman's health care bill died, but it laid the groundwork for future Democrat presidents, culminating in the disastrous Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Following the refusal of Congress to vote on civil rights legislation led by Truman, he integrated the military on July 26, 1948, and issued Executive Order 9981, which eventually outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin in the United States Armed Forces. In effect, Truman had desegregated the military and launched the first major action guaranteeing equal rights. But there would be a long way to go, and Southern Democrats became enraged when he began supporting civil rights for blacks. Led by South Carolina Governor and later U.S. Senator Strom Thurmond, the Southerners broke away and established the States' Rights Party, also known as the Dixiecrat faction. The Democrat Party was forever fractured in two parts: the Southern Democrats, who imposed Jim Crow laws, and Northern Democrats, who were more in line with Republicans on civil rights. Truman, being from Missouri, was considered a traitor. Truman was also attacked by the pro-communist left wing of his party because of his policy towards the Soviets, which they regarded as aggressive and provocative. As a result, Franklin Roosevelt's former vice president, Henry Wallace, and his followers established the Progressive Party. The House Un-American Activities Committee, created in 1938, was to root out communists in the federal government and was accelerated under Truman and led by Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. During this period, Truman had to intervene where accusations arose regarding communists being in the federal government, even in the CIA, which he created and later disliked but was unable to completely rein in, as Director Alan Walsh Dulles wielded a lot of political power. In March 1947, under pressure from Attorney General Tom Clark, Truman created his loyalty program and signed Executive Order 9835, prescribing procedures for the administration of an employee's loyalty program in the executive branch of the government. This program, being authorized by the Attorney General, basically forced employees to fill out a form, declare their political beliefs, voting record, and establish departmental loyalty boards to conduct loyalty screenings of federal employees and job applicants. It also allowed the FBI to investigate anyone applying under the fear of subversion. This was considered by many to be unconstitutional, violating the Fifth and Ninth Amendments, as it pried into people's privacy. The loyalty program had been criticized as a weapon of hysteria attacking law-abiding citizens and for helping create the Joseph McCarthy witch hunts. The Attorney General's office compiled its list of subversive organizations, and not just communists, but persons known to have prior involvement in protest or labor strikes were investigated by the FBI. As the Cold War intensified, these investigations grew more frequent and far-reaching, such as the illegal COINTELPRO under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. See our video on him. Also in 1947, President Harry S. Truman pledged that the United States would help any nation resist communism in order to prevent its spread. His policy of containment is known as the Truman Doctrine, and American taxpayers footed the bill, and billions of dollars went overseas to fund corrupt governments and overthrow those democracies deemed too weak to resist communism. The most important countries under threat at that time were Greece, which fought a bloody civil war right after World War II, and Turkey, which bordered the Soviet Union, as well as the newly created nation of South Korea. It was also feared that Italy would follow Yugoslavia, Albania, and Eastern Europe, with special interest in Guatemala and Iran, so Truman authorized operations and massive expenditures in those countries. Truman was, however, the first world leader to officially recognize Israel as a legitimate Jewish state, much to the chagrin of many in Washington on May 14, 1948. Truman reminded his detractors that he did not have any Arabs voting for him in the Democratic Party. This was also a period which saw him take the lead in creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and having it ratified by the Senate. In June 1948, the Soviet Union, whose territory fully surrounded Berlin, cut off all ground traffic into and out of West Berlin to force the Allies to abandon the city. Truman rightfully then took bold action and ordered the Berlin airlift, which Curtis LeMay executed. By 1949, the United States was locked in fierce competition with the Soviet Union for influence in the world. This was considered to be the greatest threat to the post-war world. Korea and Vietnam, formerly French Indochina, had both been divided between a communist North and a democratic South. Tensions were rising there. Since World War II, the United States had been unable to stop the Soviet Union from dominating Eastern Europe due to the weak-minded policies of FDR. Truman feared that other struggling countries recovering from the war would experience a similar fate. On January 20, 1949, after his re-election, President Harry S. Truman delivered his second inaugural address and introduced his four-point program. This would see a flood of American tax dollars going overseas, along with the Marshall Plan to prevent nations recovering from the war from going into the communist sphere of influence. On October 1, 1949, the People's Republic of China was officially created after the communists won their civil war, and plenty of blame went around. Truman had promised to support the nationalists, but he did not. He was blamed for not actively supporting Chiang Kai-shek against the communists, but Truman did not want to engage in what could be a major Asian war. He believed that he could have brought the Soviets into it. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea by crossing over the 38th parallel with the support of the Soviet Union. Truman did not press for a congressional declaration of war. Instead, he classified the Korean conflict as a UN-led police action operating under the authority of the Security Council. Eventually, 53 United Nations allies would send over 19,000 troops to Korea, and over 1.7 million Americans would serve in this conflict. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed as Supreme Allied Commander and was initially quite successful in driving back the North Korean forces over the 38th parallel. He made a controversial move, however, when he continued to push the North Koreans all the way to the Yalu River north, which is the border with China. He then suggested bombing cities in China that were thought to be aiding the North Korean troops. Truman feared China would get involved, and Curtis E. LeMay believed that would happen anyway, and he supported MacArthur. MacArthur did not believe the Chinese would get involved, and if they did, the USSR would not join the war, but that proved to be an error. Truman chose the side of caution, but his passive response did not prevent 300,000 Chinese soldiers joining the fight. Truman was trying to negotiate a ceasefire, but MacArthur made that difficult when he ordered his troops to invade North Korea and pushed the communists up past the 38th parallel. When they hit the Yalu River, that was when Truman had had enough. Truman also underestimated the support being given by Stalin and the USSR. This was not the first or last time that MacArthur had ignored direct orders from Truman. Truman was incensed when MacArthur reached the Yalu River, and Truman lost his mind. On April 11, 1951, Truman officially relieved Douglas MacArthur of his command, and word spread quickly, upsetting most Americans. Truman felt that MacArthur had overstepped his authority, which in fact he did, although he did have the positive impact of forcing other UN nations to take a more active role in the war. But he did defy his direct orders and interfered with ending the Korean War quickly. There were a few who believed that MacArthur's plan would have worked and kept China at bay, with LeMay being one of them. The real threat was the Soviet Union, as they had the atomic bomb also. Truman also had problems back home. The Office of Price Stabilization had previously enacted price controls on various wartime industries, including steel tonnage pricing, while the Wage Stabilization Board worked to limit wage increases for workers to what they felt was a reasonable amount. With these two agencies being involved, the U.S. was able to keep producing war materials without interruption from labor and industry disputes over prices and wages. However, this was not popular with the workers, and when there was a danger to this authority, Truman acted. Due to the threat of strikes by the steel workers and with the Korean War's requirements, Truman issued Executive Order 10340 to seize control of the steel industries on April 8, 1952. The companies sued the government in a class action, resulting in a Supreme Court decision determining that Truman had overstepped his constitutional powers in the steel seizures. The ruling held that the president had acted unconstitutionally because neither Congress nor the Constitution gave him the authority to seize the steel mills. Truman had many controversies, legally, morally, and ethically. His actions may be deemed as necessary for the times or immoral and illegal and self-serving, depending upon your perspective. Harry S. Truman died on December 26, 1972 in Kansas City, Missouri, and is still considered by many to be one of the best U.S. presidents we've ever had, and some consider him one of the worst, but we will let you decide.
Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.